My stepmother thought she could erase me from my father's will and walk away with everything he left behind. What she didn't know was that I had one final card to play the secret lawyer my father trusted more than anyone else. And when the truth came out, her downfall was as humiliating as it was inevitable. Before we dive into this story, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on so you never miss a tale of justice. And I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from today? Let me know in the comments. Okay, let's get into it. When my father passed away, I believed the most painful part of my life had already arrived. I was grieving, unmoored, and trying to adjust to a world without his voice guiding me. But as it turned out, the real storm was only beginning. The shock didn't come from his absence that part, as unbearable as it was, I had prepared myself for. What blindsided me was the woman who should have been grieving with me, my stepmother. Instead of sitting with me in shared sorrow, she seemed almost energized in the days after the funeral, like she had been waiting for this moment to seize control. It started subtly, the kind of things you could almost overlook when you're deep in mourning. She spoke in clipped tones whenever I asked about Dad's belongings. She made comments like, "Don't worry, I'll handle all of this now." She took over conversations with extended family, positioning herself as the sole decision-maker, as though I had no right to even be part of those discussions. I wanted to give her the benefit of the doubt. Grief can make people act strangely, I told myself. Maybe she was overcompensating because she was scared. Or maybe she was just trying to take charge because she thought someone had to. But deep down, a quiet unease started to form in my chest. Something about the way she carried herself felt less like a widow's sorrow, and more like someone calculating their next move. And then came the blow I couldn't ignore. Barely a week after we had laid my father to rest, she approached me with a folder of papers. I remember the way she looked at me, her eyes sharp, lips twisted into a smile that never reached them. She placed the folder on the table and slid it toward me like a dealer at a casino. "These," she said, her voice dripping with triumph, "are the updated documents. Your father wanted to make sure I was taken care of. You'll see here everything has been left to me. It's what he wanted." Her words were so casual, so dismissive, that for a moment I thought I had misheard her. I opened the folder with trembling hands, scanning the neatly typed lines. And there it was, in black and white, a will that named her as the sole heir, leaving me with nothing. My throat went dry. I couldn't breathe. My father, who had loved me with all his heart, who had promised me that no matter what happened I would always have a home. Was I supposed to believe he had simply erased me from his legacy? I looked up at her, searching for some sign that this was a mistake. But the smirk tugging at the corner of her mouth told me everything. She was enjoying this. She wanted me to see the defeat in my eyes, to feel small and powerless. That was the moment the grief shifted into something else. A cold clarity spread through me. My stepmother wasn't just greedy, she was ruthless. And if I didn't act, she was going to rob me not just of my inheritance, but of every last piece of my father's memory. This wasn't going to be just a fight over money. It was going to be a fight for justice. Before I take you deeper into the storm, let me step back and tell you about the world I came from, and the people who lived at the center of it. To understand why my stepmother's betrayal cut so deeply, you have to understand the bond I had with my father, and the complicated role she played in our lives. My father was, in every sense of the word, a steady man. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't ambitious in the cutthroat way that some people admire. but he was grounded. He worked hard his entire life to provide stability, and he believed in treating people with fairness and respect. To me, he wasn't just a parent, he was a compass. His voice was the one I heard in my head when I had to make difficult decisions. His presence was the one that made me feel safe, no matter how chaotic the world became. We weren't wealthy in the sense of luxury or extravagance, but my father had built a life that was comfortable and secure. He owned our family home, a modest but beautiful place filled with decades of memories. He had savings, investments, and the sort of practical nest egg that comes from years of careful planning. He wasn't reckless with money, and he never chased after things he couldn't afford. That practicality, I think, was part of what made him trustworthy not just to me, but to everyone who knew him. And then there was my stepmother. She entered our lives a few years after my mother passed away. At first, I wanted to welcome her. My father seemed happier with companionship, and I thought maybe this woman could bring some warmth back into his life. But almost from the beginning, there was a chill in the air between us. She wasn't outwardly cruel in those early days. In fact, to outsiders, she was charming, always well-dressed, always ready with a polite smile. But when it came to me, her charm had edges. She rarely used my name, preferring phrases like "your daughter" when she spoke to my father. She had a way of excluding me from conversations, of turning family gatherings into something that revolved entirely around her. Over time, I noticed her habits, how she scrutinized people for what they could give her, how she measured her words like someone constantly playing a game of strategy. She loved appearances, new jewelry, expensive handbags, little luxuries that didn't quite match my father's natural modesty. I often wondered how much of their marriage was built on love, and how much was built on what she stood to gain. My father, to his credit, always tried to bridge the gap between us. He would reassure me, saying things like, "She means well, give her time," or "Don't worry, you'll always have me." And I believed him. I trusted him completely. If he said I was secure, then I was secure. But those little warning signs began to add up. After his passing, they became impossible to ignore. I remember one particular afternoon, maybe just a few days after the funeral. I walked into the living room and found her rifling through his desk drawers. She didn't notice me at first, and I stood frozen, watching as she pulled out envelopes, notebooks, and little keepsakes. When she finally saw me, she snapped the drawer shut and gave me a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. "Oh, don't worry," she said breezily. "I'm just organizing things. Your father left me in charge of all this." It was such a simple phrase, but the way she emphasized me stuck with me. She wasn't just taking care of his things, she was laying claim to them. The normal world, if you could even call it that, was a fragile balance. I was mourning a father I adored, while living under the roof of a woman who had always seen me as an obstacle. The air in that house was heavy with unspoken tension, and even in my grief, I could sense the direction the winds were blowing. And sure enough, those winds were carrying me toward a storm I never imagined, because the day she handed me that fraudulent will, all of those quiet suspicions crystallized into certainty. She wasn't simply overstepping, she was plotting. And if I didn't find a way to fight back, she was going to succeed in wiping me out of my own father's legacy. The papers she handed me that day should have felt like a formality, some routine business after a death in the family. Instead, they were the knife that cut through any illusion of civility between us. I remember sitting at the dining table, my hands trembling as I turned the pages. The air felt too thick, pressing down on me, while she stood at the other end of the table, like a queen overseeing her victory. She didn't sit down beside me. She didn't even pretend to soften the blow. She just watched. At first, I couldn't even make sense of what I was seeing. My name absent. Entire sections that should have included me empty. Instead, it was all her. The house, the accounts, even the small family heirlooms that held no value except to those who had grown up with them. It was all signed over to her, as if I had never existed. I don't understand. I managed to whisper. My throat was dry, my voice cracking. She leaned forward slightly, resting her hand on the back of a chair, her smile sharp. It's simple. Your father wanted to make sure I was cared for. He trusted me to handle things. There was no grief in her tone, no hint of sadness. It was triumph pure and unrestrained. In that moment, something inside me broke. Not because I believed the papers I knew my father better than that, but because of the audacity it took for her to shove them in my face, to assume I would simply roll over and accept being erased from his legacy. You're lying, I said, though my voice was soft. It wasn't accusation. Her laugh was short and sharp. Do what you want. You'll see soon enough that this is final. And with that, she swept the papers back into her possession, as if she was already the rightful queen of everything my father had built. When she left the room, I sat in silence, staring at the wood grain of the table. The grief that had been suffocating me just hours earlier was now mixed with something else entirely. Determination. My father's memory was too strong, his promises too clear, for me to believe he had willingly cast me aside. That was the moment. I knew I couldn't just grieve quietly and move on. I had to fight. She had crossed a line she could never uncross, and in doing so, she had lit the fire that would burn her carefully built empire of lies to the ground. Asterisk if I had hoped that my stepmother's fraud was some isolated moment of desperation. Those hopes were crushed within days. She didn't slow down. She didn't hesitate. If anything, my refusal to immediately bow to her so-called updated documents seemed to fuel her determination. It began with the house. The walls that had once held my childhood laughter and my father's voice suddenly became hostile territory. She started locking doors, insisting certain rooms were hers now. The study, which had always been my father's sacred space, was stripped of his books within a week. I walked in one afternoon to find the shelves bare and his desk gone. "Where's Dad's desk?" I asked, my voice cracking. She barely looked up from her phone. "Sold." It was old and bulky. "I don't need clutter around here." The way she said it, clutter, as though my father's life work and the very furniture where he had spent countless evenings writing, reading, and planning were nothing more than junk to be discarded. But she didn't stop there. Soon, I noticed heirlooms disappearing. A silver pocket watch that had belonged to my grandfather, a framed photograph of my grandmother in her wedding gown, even a box of letters my father had written when he was young, letters I had cherished for years. When I confronted her, she shrugged, her eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "I have every right. These things are mine now. You'll just have to let go." It wasn't just the loss of objects, it was the way she twisted the knife with every word. She seemed to revel in my pain, as though each item she sold or discarded was a victory in her private war against me. I tried to reach out to relatives, hoping someone would step in, but she was quick to cut off those avenues too. She positioned herself as the grieving widow, insisting she was merely tidying up and handling responsibilities. To anyone who hadn't lived under the same roof, she looked like the picture of composure and efficiency. behind closed doors, though. She was ruthless. I'll never forget one particular night. I walked into the kitchen to find her sipping wine, a stack of papers spread across the table. She looked up at me with a glint in her eye and said, "By the end of the month, this house will be on the market. I'm not staying in a place full of memories." My chest tightened. "You're selling the house." She smiled sweetly, though her words dripped venom. "Why not? It's my house now, and the sooner I cash out, the sooner I can move on." The thought of strangers walking through the rooms where my father had lived, touching the walls he had built with his own hands, made my stomach churn. She wasn't just erasing me, she was erasing him. And as the days passed, her arrogance only grew. She paraded around in new clothes, new jewelry, the spoils of her quick cash sales. She acted untouchable, like she had already secured her victory and I was just a nuisance she had to tolerate until I disappeared. But as much as her actions cut me, they also strengthened my resolve. Every item she sold, every cruel smirk, every dismissive remark was fuel to the fire building inside me. She thought she was cementing her power. What she didn't realize was that she was setting the stage for her own downfall. Grief is heavy, but even grief has limits. And when cruelty piles on top of it, there comes a moment when sorrow hardens into resolve. For me, that moment came the day she sold the one thing I thought she would never dare touch. My father had a watch, not a flashy, diamond-studded thing, but a simple silver timepiece that had been in our family for generations. He wore it almost every day of his adult life, and as a child, I used to watch him wind it before heading out the door. The soft ticking was a sound that meant comfort. To me, it was more than just an heirloom, it was a piece of him, something he had promised one day would be mine. I had asked her for it once, gently, almost pleading. "Please, can I at least keep Dad's watch? It's all I want. I don't care about the money. I just want something of his to hold onto." Her response had been cold, but not definitive. She waved her hand dismissively, muttering something about sentimental nonsense. At the time, I still hoped she might leave it alone. But then one evening, I logged onto an online marketplace to check listings for an unrelated item, and my heart stopped. There, staring back at me from a photograph, was my father's watch. The caption read, "Vintage silver timepiece, excellent condition." And the seller, my stepmother. I sat frozen, my hands shaking on the keyboard. The bile rose in my throat, hot and bitter. I clicked on the listing again and again, as if it would change, as if I could will it not to be true. But the truth was undeniable. She had taken the one piece of him I couldn't bear to lose, and she had hawked it to the highest bidder. When I confronted her, the conversation burned itself into my memory. "How could you?" I demanded, my voice trembling. That watch was his life. It was supposed to stay in the family. She didn't even flinch. She swirled the wine in her glass, looking at me with that smug detachment that had become her trademark. "It's just a watch. And, frankly, I needed the cash. You'll learn to let go eventually." Those words, "just a watch," were the spark that lit the fuse in that instant. My grief turned into something colder, sharper. The ache in my chest hardened into steel. I realized then that pleading with her, hoping for scraps of mercy, would get me nowhere. She had no respect for me, no respect for my father, and no boundaries she wouldn't cross. I stopped crying in front of her after that day. I stopped begging. She mistook my silence for defeat. But what I was really doing was gathering strength. Because if she thought she had erased me, if she thought she had won, Then she was about to learn that she had underestimated me completely. That was the night I made the decision. I was going to fight her. Not just emotionally, not just with words, but with proof, with power, with something she could not twist or laugh away. And I would find it. After the watch incident, something inside me crystallized. I knew I couldn't let her win, but knowing I wanted justice and actually finding a way to achieve it were two very different things. For a while, I felt stuck, pacing my father's empty study, staring at the shelves where his books used to be. My mind ran in circles. What could I do? What proof did I have? She was waving around documents that looked official, and I was just his daughter grieving, angry, but powerless. Or so it seemed. And then, one night, as I sat at his old writing table, the one piece of furniture she hadn't managed to sell yet, I remembered something. It was a conversation I had had with him a year before his health declined. We had been sitting on the porch, sipping tea, talking about ordinary things. And then he had said, almost casually, I've been meeting with someone about the estate, just in case. I want to make sure everything is handled fairly when I'm gone. At the time, I had brushed it off. I didn't want to think about him not being there. I never pressed for details. But now, his words came back like a flare in the dark. I've been meeting with someone, a lawyer. I rushed back to the desk and began opening drawers, flipping through notebooks, searching every corner. My stepmother had cleared out much of his things, but she had overlooked a small leather-bound planner shoved into the back of a drawer. My father's handwriting covered the pages, appointments, notes, little reminders, and there it was. A name, a phone number, a small, neat note written in his tidy script. Estate meeting, private. Don't forget questions for JL. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. My hands shook as I traced the ink with my fingertip. This wasn't just some vague recollection. This was proof. My father had made plans, real plans that she knew nothing about. The next morning, I called the number. My voice was unsteady as I asked for the name written in the planner. There was a pause on the other end, and then a calm, professional voice said, "Yes, this is Attorney James Larkin. How may I help you?" When I explained who I was, the silence that followed was weighted. Then he said words that changed everything. "I've been expecting you." My breath caught. "Expecting me?" "Yes," he said firmly. "Your father was very clear. He anticipated there might be complications. I have the documents he left in place. Would you like to come in to review them?" I could barely choke out a yes before the tears came. Relief, gratitude, disbelief all crashing over me at once. My father hadn't abandoned me. He had thought ahead. He had trusted someone outside of her reach, to protect his true wishes. The unique weapon was real, and it was sitting in the hands of a lawyer she didn't even know existed. As I hung up the phone, a calmness settled over me. The kind of calm that comes when you realize the ground under your feet is solid after all. She thought she had buried me with her lies and fake paperwork. She thought I had no fight left in me. But I wasn't defeated. Not anymore. For the first time since his death, I allowed myself a small, quiet smile. The game had changed. Walking into Attorney Larkin's office for the first time felt like stepping into a sanctuary. The air smelled faintly of leather and paper. The walls lined with shelves of law books, their spines worn from use. It was the kind of place my father would have trusted, quiet, serious. No pretense, Larkin greeted me warmly, his handshake firm but not overbearing. He was older, maybe in his late 50s, with a calm presence that instantly steadied me. When I sat down across from him, he didn't waste time with pleasantries. He opened a drawer, pulled out a folder, and slid it across the desk. "Your father wanted you to have this," he said. Inside was the real will, neatly typed, notarized, legally binding. As my eyes moved down the pages, relief poured through me. The house left to me, the majority of his savings and investments left to me, with a portion reserved for her so she would be comfortable, but not extravagant. Even the heirlooms specifically listed, named as mine to preserve debt, it was all there. My father's voice, echoing through those pages, cutting through the lies she had tried to spin. Tears blurred my vision, and I whispered, "He really did protect me." Larkin nodded. He was very clear about his intentions. He even warned me there might be attempts to challenge them. That's why everything was filed, signed, and backed with airtight documentation. He wanted to be certain his wishes couldn't be twisted. I sat back, my mind racing. She had strutted around the house with her false documents, mocking me, selling things off as if she already owned them outright. She thought she was untouchable, but she had no idea this man, this plan, this truth existed. For the first time in weeks, I felt power return to me. Together, Mr. Larkin and I built our case. He instructed me to keep quiet, to let her continue her games, because the deeper she dug, the worse her position would become. Every unauthorized sale, every false claim, every arrogant display, each one was another nail in the coffin of her credibility. So I waited. I let her laugh in my face. I let her sell furniture, jewelry, even parts of the property. I let her pour money into her shopping sprees, confident that the world was already hers. Outwardly, I appeared defeated, resigned to her dominance. But inside, I was coiled like a spring, waiting for the right moment. When the probate hearing date finally arrived, she practically floated into the courthouse. She wore a tailored black dress, a string of pearls, and that same smug smile she had worn the day she shoved the false will in front of me. She even had the audacity to pat my arm as we sat down, whispering, "Don't embarrass yourself. Just accept it." I didn't respond. I didn't need to, because sitting quietly beside me, briefcase in hand, was Attorney Larkin. The judge entered, the room came to order, and the proceedings began. She was brimming with confidence, her lawyer presenting the so-called updated documents she had clung to so tightly. She leaned back in her chair as if the matter was already settled, as if she were waiting for the gavel to fall in her favor. And then Larkin stood. "Your Honor," he began, his voice calm but firm. "Before we proceed any further, I would like to present into record the official, notarized last will and testament of the deceased, filed with my office more than a year before the documents my learned colleague has provided." The room seemed to freeze. My stepmother's smile faltered, just slightly, as he placed the folder on the judge's bench. "This will," he continued, "outlines the deceased's true intentions in clear, unambiguous language. It supersedes any document presented here today, and it leaves the majority of the estate to his daughter, as was his wish." The sound of the pages turning in the judge's hands was like a drumbeat to me, steady, final, inevitable, and for the first time, I saw fear flicker across her face. The silence in that courtroom was thick enough to choke on. For weeks, she had lorded her supposed victory over me, and now the judge's eyes scanned each page of my father's real will. Every second that ticked by chipped away at her composure. At first, She tried to mask it. She leaned toward her attorney, whispering rapidly, her lips pressed into a tight line. But her voice carried just enough for me to catch fragments. This can't be real. Where did this come from? This wasn't supposed to happen. Her attorney's face said it all. He hadn't expected this either. He shuffled through his papers, looking increasingly pale as Larkin calmly explained the timeline, how the will had been notarized, filed, and witnessed properly long before her so-called update had ever surfaced. Then came the kicker. Larkin handed over a statement of property sales evidence of all the furniture, jewelry, and assets she had illegally sold off while claiming ownership. He had traced each transaction, every careless indulgence she had made. "Your Honor," he said smoothly, "not only has she presented invalid documents, but she has also engaged in the unlawful sale of estate property without consent. I have documentation to prove every single instance." Her face drained of color. No, that's not true," she burst out, standing so suddenly that her chair screeched across the floor. "This is some kind of trick. She must have forged this." He would never. The judge's gavel slammed down. "Sit down, Mum. Outbursts will not be tolerated." She sat, trembling, glaring at me as if I had conjured this all out of thin air. The mask of superiority she had worn so proudly was gone, replaced by raw panic. Her pearl necklace quivered against her chest as she tried to steady her breathing. And for the first time, I didn't feel small in her presence. I didn't feel like the powerless stepdaughter she could bully. I felt like the rightful heir, the daughter my father had trusted, the woman who had outlasted every cruel scheme she had devised. The judge continued, "The will presented by Attorney Larkin is valid and binding. The estate will be distributed as outlined within it. The alternate documents are dismissed." Her lawyer tried one last desperate move. "Your Honor, perhaps we could contest on grounds," but the judge cut him off. "Grounds of what? There is no ambiguity here. This case is settled." The words struck like thunder. Settled. Final. That's when her composure shattered completely. She turned on me, her voice shrill, echoing off the courtroom walls. "You think you've won? You think this makes you better than me? I was the one who took care of him in his last years. I was the one who sat by his side while you—" I didn't respond. I didn't need to. My silence was louder than her screams, because in that moment, everyone in the room could see her for what she was. A greedy, manipulative woman whose lies had unraveled in the face of truth. And nothing she said could change that. Her downfall wasn't dramatic fireworks, it was worse. It was the slow, humiliating realization that all her arrogance, all her scheming, had led her to nothing. She had clawed for everything and ended up with less than she had started with. And as the bailiff escorted her out of the courtroom for continuing to argue with the judge, I finally allowed myself a small, steady breath of victory asterisk. When the gavel finally came down, it felt like my father himself was speaking through the judge, steady, unshakable, and fair. But the truest satisfaction came not in that courtroom. It came in the days immediately after. I'll never forget the phone call I received just 2 mornings later. It was from the estate manager, a calm, professional man who had overseen the property while the legal fight dragged on. "We've begun inventorying the house," he said, "and as per the court's ruling, everything that was sold off without authorization will be accounted for. Any buyers who purchased under fraudulent circumstances will be reimbursed and his voice dipped slightly, will be held personally liable for the financial damages." Held liable. Those words sank in sweet and deep. Her greed hadn't just lost her the inheritance, now it had shackled her with debt. Every necklace she pawned, Every antique chair she sold off behind my back, every dollar she thought she had pocketed was about to be clawed back with interest. The final payoff moment came when I returned to the house. The one she had strutted through like a queen. The one she once told me I'd never set foot in again. This time, it was mine. The locks had been changed. Her car was gone. The walls, once cluttered with the gaudy decorations she insisted on, stood bare where her stolen sales had gutted them. And there, on the marble entryway table, lay a single, official letter addressed to her, a demand for repayment from the court. I stood in that quiet hallway, sunlight spilling through the window, and let myself breathe it all in. For so long, she had towered over me with threats, with manipulation, with arrogance. Now the very house she tried to erase me from had become her symbol of defeat. She had clawed at my father's legacy, and in the end, she lost everything because of her own greed. I walked through the rooms, one by one, not in mourning but in gratitude. Gratitude that the truth had held firm. Gratitude that my father's wishes had been honored. Gratitude that justice had not only been served, it had been poetic. The final image burned in my memory is this. As I stood by the front door, ready to leave, a moving truck pulled up to the curb. Inside were the very antiques she had illegally sold, being returned to the estate. Each piece was carried past me, one after another, as if the universe itself was restoring what she had tried to steal. And I smiled, quiet, steady, and unshakable, because this wasn't just my victory. It was my father's. In the weeks that followed, the dust slowly began to settle. The estate process, once a battlefield, turned into something more like a quiet restoration. Bit by bit, my father's belongings were accounted for, repaired, and returned. It was painstaking, but with each item that came back, I felt a little more whole, like pieces of him were being handed back to me, after she'd tried so hard to strip them away. As for her, the spiral was swift and brutal. The court judgment was ironclad. Not only was she stripped of any claim to my father's estate, but she was also personally responsible for the restitution of everything she'd stolen. Word spread quickly in her circles. Friends she used to flaunt her wealth, to suddenly disappeared. People she thought would stand by her wanted nothing to do with a woman branded a fraud. In the public record, within months, she had lost her apartment, her car, and the little reputation she clung to. I heard, through one of my father's old acquaintances, that she had tried to appeal the judgment. The court rejected it immediately. She had no leverage left, no lies to spin, no one to manipulate. And me? I chose not to gloat publicly, though heaven knows I had reason to. Instead, I honored my father in the way I knew would make him proud. I preserved the house. I carefully organized his documents, his books, his old letters. I even opened a small gallery room in his memory, where close friends and relatives could come and remember him as the man he truly was. Financially, I didn't live lavishly. I didn't need to. What mattered was that my father's legacy remained intact, and that I could live my life, free from the poisonous presence of someone who saw me as an obstacle rather than family. There was one evening, months later, when I sat on the porch of the house with a cup of tea in hand. The sun was setting in warm gold across the yard, and for the first time since his passing, I felt real peace. The bitterness, the sleepless nights, the endless court hearings, they were behind me. I realized something important then. Justice doesn't always roar like thunder. Sometimes it whispers. Sometimes it's simply the quiet fact that those who scheme and manipulate will eventually collapse under the weight of their own greed. And that's exactly what happened to her. She tried to cut me out of my father's will. She tried to erase me from his legacy. But in the end, she only erased herself. I carry that knowledge with me now, not as a source of pride, but as a reminder that truth and patience are powerful allies. That greed, no matter how carefully disguised, always leads to ruin. And so my father's memory lives on, not tarnished by betrayal, but strengthened by justice. The script is now complete. Asterisk.